Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full PreFrontal, where we are exposing the mysteries of executive function. I am here with our host, as always, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, Sucheta. Good to be with you as usual. Looking forward to your second conversation with Dr. Roy Baumeister. But you're going to lead off the conversation today by talking about full-body x-rays not in the hospital, which should be interesting, but also a discussion around planning and goal-directed behaviors.
Yes. Have I intrigued you enough, Todd?
Oh, you typically do with your kickoff stories, let me assure you.
Well, so BBC recently reported a story of a woman in Dongguan railway station in southern China. She arrived at the security checkpoint at the train station where she was asked to place her belongings on the conveyor belt so that it could be screened. She wasn't sure if it was safe for her belongings and they would be guaranteed the safety that she was looking for. So what she did is only, Lord help us all, highly imaginative people can think about is she climbed on the conveyor belt with her handbag and went through the x-ray machine herself. Footage, it shows that the woman is kneeling on all fours as she passes through the tunnel and emerges on the other side. Within days, on the Chinese newspaper's Facebook page, there was a warning that read, "Passengers are warned that not only is this behavior forbidden, but also the radiation from the machine is incredibly harmful to human health." So it's a fascinating story in this regard that the question came to my mind is, did this woman think through before jumping onto the conveyor belt? I must agree that it was quite an innovative solution to the concern she had. Apparently, it was reported later on that, this event happened very close to Chinese New Year. And a lot of people who are not local to the region travel with cash in their bags and take off to go home and visit their families and bring their wages that they have saved over time. So I bet that was the reason that she was not very confident about this business of x-ray machine and her money. But the question that came to my mind that did this individual, saw the tree but failed to see the forest? She didn't adhere to the expectation. She didn't plan and think about the big picture. And so what's the big picture is getting in trouble with the law or having a challenge with her health. So this temporary temptation and jumping the gun and protecting her possession kind of is truly taking her attention away from the future thoughts. So this is what I think today we are going to talk about. Dr. Baumeister is going to help us understand the process that goes into planning and goal-directed behaviors, which are humanly very unique to human beings. Our individual capacity as humans exceeds animal planning capacities in a way that we can fast forward way, way, way into the future. And really connecting to last week's podcast about self-control is we keep the goals in mind and hence we control ourselves so that we can actually fulfill the goals that we have for ourselves. So Roy Baumeister is currently professor of psychology at the University of Queensland in Australia. He is among the most prolific and most frequently cited psychologists in the world with over 600 publications. His 35 books include the New York Times bestseller Willpower, Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength. My personal favorite, in addition to the Willpower book, is The Cultural Animal, Human Nature, Meaning, and Social Life. It's a must read for every person who's interested in working with executive function and how do we regulate ourselves in social context. Roy Baumeister's research covers concepts such as self and identity, self-regulation, interpersonal rejection, sexuality and gender, aggression, self-esteem, free will, and self-presentation. In 2013, he received the William James Award from the Association of Psychological Sciences It's their highest honor, which was the Lifetime Achievement in Psychological Sciences. He has appeared on numerous television shows, including Dateline NBC, ABC's 2020, as well as PBS, National Public Radio, and countless other news shows. His work has been covered or quoted in New York Times, The Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, The Economist, Newsweek, Time and Psychology Today, and so on and so forth. He is a terrific and prolific speaker. The clarity he brings to the topics that intrigue all of us is really why this conversation is going to be very special, Todd.
I'm still trying to process a human going through that conveyor system. I agree with what you said earlier. It is an innovative solution to that problem that she perceived. Fascinating stuff. Well, this promises to also be another intriguing conversation. Very much looking forward to getting into it. Let's get to it. Here is Sucheta's second conversation with Dr. Roy Baumeister.
Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Baumeister. I'm so happy to have you. And this is our second interview. And today I was hoping that we will address the concept of planning and goal-directed behaviors. In my work with executive function, many times people who are struggling with managing themselves are often behaving in a disconnected way. They do not have a sense of the big picture when it comes to their own life and the multifaceted goals that they have. So my first question is, executive function is often described as the goal-directed self-regulation. What is your understanding from your research as well as social psychology and social cognition, the process of goal setting and planning, and how are they connected to each other? I don't know if I can throw this one more question, which is why some people are more intuitive about it while others struggle with it.
Many animals have behavior that can be described as goal-directed, but human beings surpass others in our ability to think about particular futures, to evaluate and choose among them, and then to organize present behavior based on how we think it will lead to these future goals. Planning is a key aspect of that. Setting goals is something that most people do, but probably all could get a little better at it. Particularly, people tend to be overly optimistic in terms of what they'll be able to achieve, and especially in terms of how fast, how smoothly things will go toward their goal. In setting goals, what's important is to set both the long-term goals of where do you want to end up and sort of subsidiary goals or your steps along the path in that direction. So you see, well, what do I do first and how do I make the first few steps there? So it's fine if you have a grand ambition, say that you want to be president of General Motors, you can't just start trying to become president tomorrow. You have to work out a plan of how are you going to get from here to there? What education do you need? What background? What first jobs will you get? And how will you rise through the ranks to get there? So if you only have the long-term goal and no short-term ones, you'll flounder around because that's not how things work. And if you only have short-term goals, like what you want to accomplish this week and don't think really beyond the end of the week, then where your life ends up is likely to be somewhat random, doing fine for this week. But then after many years, you think, well, how did I end up here? You're sort of leaving too much to chance. So some combination of the long-term grand goal in between steps to get there is vital for success. Plans need to be flexible also. If you work out all sorts of detailed plans for exactly how you're going to spend the next month, how you're going to reach some task, well, then things go wrong. And as soon as something doesn't go according to plan, then the whole plan is ruined. So you need some flexibility built into the plan. There's a famous study some years ago where they had students either make daily plans, weekly plans, setting goals for the whole semester as a whole. But the weekly to monthly plans were the most successful. The ones who planned every day, again, as soon as something went wrong, the plan was ruined and couldn't take the time to make a whole nother plan right away again. But, I want to have this much done this week. Well, then today, if you can't get the materials from the library, or computer doesn't work, or some problem turns out to be more difficult to work on than you anticipated, well, you've got some flexibility and you can work a little bit more on that tomorrow and you'll still be there at the end of the week, roughly where you wanted to be. There's also good evidence for something called the planning fallacy, which I've already suggested to some degree, is that most things are longer and more difficult than people imagine. People are just unrealistically optimistic when they make plans. Tell my students when we're doing research, everything in research is going to take twice as long as you imagine that it should take. I think that helps them because otherwise I think, oh, I'm going to do this today and this tomorrow and have the whole project wrapped up in a week and a half. It rarely works that well. And this seems to be something with not an inability to understand time per se, but something to do with ourselves and our confidence and our optimism that things will go well. There's another well-known study in which they asked students to plan, when are you going to get your thesis done? Best case, when will it get done? Worst case, when will it get done? And of course, they didn't, on average, get it done even by the worst case. Another feature of this experiment is they also asked the roommates, when do you think so-and-so is going to get it done? And the roommates were pretty accurate. Other people have a perspective on us that it's somehow just hard to adopt in making plans for ourselves. So if you get somebody like a roommate who's seen you in action and probably has a little bit more objective sense of when you'll get things done, you might want to confer with someone like that. This is a realistic plan for me. And of course, people want to be nice and be supportive and so on, but at least the evidence suggests people in general are better at predicting others than predicting themselves. And when making plans, there are costs and dangers for not getting things done on time. Say another piece of evidence, when was the last time you heard of a major project, building a building or whatever, that was brought in under budget and on time, many years behind schedule and millions over the budgeted amount? So that seems to be the typical case. And when we make plans, we need to recognize that this is a common tendency. And so make allowances for lots of unexpected things to go wrong.
Let me ask one clarification here. So one sounds like the ambiguity in terms of the scope of the task or the task. And second is the connection between goal and the broken down parts that compositely make achieving that goal possible. And lastly, having a good sense of personal efficacy or personal resolve. If this is universally applicable, in my practice, I see people with neurological disorders, with concussion or traumatic brain injury, or those with developmental disorders such as ADHD and learning disabilities and OCD. They tend to have even greater problem with that. So is there any research that distinguishes between normative behavior to begin with, doesn't sound like stellar, and the difference between those with challenges?
People's planning and success of planning, it's a really underdeveloped field. There's not nearly as much as I'd like to see. So comparing different populations and seeing if people who suffer from ADHD, something like that, are worse at making plans, I don't know if that's been done. I think we're still in the research community at a more preliminary phase of figuring out what makes a good plan, how should people plan, and what makes them reluctant to plan. Our own recent work suggests, for example, that it takes energy, the same kind of energy goes into willpower, self-control, to make plans, so that when people are mentally tired, as it were, their self-control, willpower is depleted, they're less likely to plan. They don't want to plan. I suspect if we forced them to plan, their plans would also not be as good, because it takes control over your thoughts. You have to discipline yourself to think. In a sense, you're thinking backwards to make a good plan. You start with the result of what you want to happen, and then you fill in the steps backward. How do I get there from here? And we find connection with that when people think about these things, initially they're very optimistic, because maybe the first step in thinking about the future is, what do you want to happen? What would be your ideal outcome? Where do you want to be? What do you want to achieve? And then they turn more realistic or pessimistic as they start to plan and think, well, this could go wrong and that could go wrong. So even just after a few seconds, this initial optimism of, oh, sure, I can get this all done in 2 weeks. This will be fine. If they start to reflect on it, they think, oh, wait a minute, I'm dependent on these people and this has to be done and this is going to take a lot of time. So they start to realize the obstacles and problems and pitfalls. And I think that's probably useful that we evolved this way, to first have an optimistic conceptualization of where do you want to be, because you want to be moving forward toward a better life. But then we also have to recognize the difficulties that lie between us and that better life.
I have a last couple of questions. One is, a lot of your work is centered around notion of self and a self-identity. And do we have an understanding of how a person goes about determining self-efficacy, whether it comes to planning and then achieving the goals that you have identified yourself, or kind of executing all the steps that lead to success and recognizing whether you made the appropriate estimation, whether of time or the amount of success. Where does this knowledge of self come from?
People have a lot of beliefs about themselves that simply aren't correct or that are inflated. People tend to think that they are better than they are. Something in the research called the better than average effect. Like the average person thinks he or she is above average. So in terms of efficacy, people tend to overestimate their capabilities and so forth. But we also get feedback from successes and failures that also make it possible to have a somewhat more realistic view of yourself. Now, you asked whether planning was essential for developing self-efficacy. It's probably not essential, because I think the beginnings of self-efficacy must come in early childhood when little children learn to master simple tasks, even things like tying their shoes, or a much bigger deal, say, is learning to walk, and before that, learning to crawl. These all give the developing child a sense of mastery. They probably don't depend that much on planning and following up on plans, but that may come along to add to it in adulthood. So the roots of self-efficacy don't require planning, but full realization in adulthood, making plans and following through and carrying them out, certainly would contribute in a big way toward that. By the same token, making plans and failing to carry them out would be a good cause to reflect on the shortcomings and your lack of efficacy, and maybe can learn how to avoid similar problems the next time.
So do we have any connection between the executionary time? So for example, how long, as you were mentioning, it takes me to tie a shoelace versus how long it takes me to take my backpack from, kitchen counter to the car. Those kinds of motoric planning estimation times, do they eventually add into some sense of executionary, like the time sense, and then eventually that's how we begin to estimate, or we don't have a clue how that works?
These are good questions. I'm reminded of the profound observation that time span really changes over the course of life, that for small children, each day seems to last almost forever. And you tell a child, well, we'll do something next week, that's like never. And then weeks start to become more salient. The early teenage years, each month is a long time, but by the time you're in your 40s, it starts to be almost years and even decades seem to go by so rapidly. So the time span seems naturally to expand as you get older, and you start to feel time go by much more rapidly.
I don't have research data where read, which explains this chronological development, internal development, where people begin to understand, or children begin to understand, this notion of passage of time. But I do know that when it comes to making long range planning, or even estimating how long it will take me to do, I'm supposed to read chapter 2 for my history, and I need to do 10 math problems. And that's a 8th grader's homework. And then you take somebody who is in 12th grade and he has to finish a paper, and he has to read 2 chapters, and he has to do study guide. So all those skills to manage time efficiently requires a sense of executionary time. How long does it take me to read? How long is the chapter? How many problems are there? Are there any difficult problems? So that capacity I see as always off for those who have significant executive function problem. And then I also see that their ability to do the traveling through time, like semester ends in 10 weeks, your halfway midpoint is in October, that they have no idea of that at all. And they are always behind their peers. But I wasn't just sure, when does this begin to consolidate into this notion of self and self-efficacy begins to emerge, where they can effectively say, oh my God, I suck at this,
Yes, I think people with executive function problems will have difficulty making plans in the sense of understanding how long things take. But put that in the context that people who are normal and healthy have difficulties too. This is, again, something that goes beyond what we see in nature. It's a specific human ability. It's something that probably hardly anyone is really expert, perfectly good at. We can get better at it, but people with psychological problems or developmental problems or executive function deficiencies, they're going to have more trouble getting to that point and coming up with accurate estimates of how long things will take than normal people who are still imperfect, but a little bit closer to it. Something you have to learn by doing, by experience. You have a contractor come to do something, repair something on your house. Well, a new contractor will often be very optimistic about, I can get this done this fast and so on. The more veteran ones will have enough experience to not promise things that will be done that fast to understand that they take longer.
So my last question to you is, how do people have a sense of part-whole relationship, or the sense of part-whole relationship, and how does that connect to, immediate, intermediate, and long-range goals? One quick example I'll give. I had a student I worked with, a college student, and during the summer, a mother gave her a job to lay down the pine straws, the beginning of fall before school began. And the guy had, come and delivered all the pine straws. And she was inside the house and she was watching her daughter's approach. And she was horrified. She had never known how disorganized her daughter was. She had no plan. She was taking one, bale at a time and placing it in the middle of the lawn and just spreading it. Looked like, some new colony was getting established. So this sense of gestalt to me is so essential to understand personal big picture. Do we have any, or is there a way you can explain how to conceptualize that when it comes to pursuing goals with that sense of continuity, sense of big picture?
That's a skill that has to be developed gradually and deliberately. I remember one thing my father taught me was, before doing a task, stop for a minute and think, how can I do this most efficiently? Sometimes there are obvious ways of doing things that are not really the ways to get them done best. So if while you're working on it, you think, well, I'll get done faster if we did it this way, or first lay out the bales exactly where they want to be, the right distance apart, and then go through and break them up together, or I don't know what. This is, again, making use of the human powers to think of different ways of doing things, something that most animals can't really do. When they learn how to do something a certain way, that's how they do it. But we can imagine alternatives and conceptualize in that way, have the idea, I want to get this done effectively and minimum amount of time and effort required. Then you have to analyze the parts of the task. It's the same with working together with other people. Is it most efficient for everyone to do all the same things, or do we divide up the task so everybody specializes in one part of it, which usually in the long run seems to be the more efficient and more effective way of doing things? This kind of systematic thinking, again, this is one of the advanced powers of the human mind, but you need to press people and challenge them, and especially children, to make them figure out for themselves, is there a better, faster, more efficient way of getting this done? And once you get in the habit of that, then you can apply that to new tasks. It's not infallible, but it's at least a big step in the right direction.
Phenomenal. Dr. Baumeister, you are an amazing, intelligent, and amazingly knowledgeable speaker, and your research has had tremendous impact on my work. I cannot thank you for being on the podcast today. It was sensational. So once again, I appreciate your time and thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Sushita. Have a good week, and I'll talk to you later.
All right. So that was Sucheta's second conversation with Dr. Baumeister. What a great conversation. I'm curious as to some of your initial thoughts.
That truly was fabulous. So here's what I've been thinking about planning skills, and Dr. Baumeister really, really laid it out in such a simplistic and yet very thoughtful way. So evolution of human prefrontal system has made goal pursuit possible. What's so special about this highly evolved system is that it allows us to set our eyes on the distant future, even if it is significantly farther apart from the current moment. We can think positively and creatively about what the future holds for us, and we have the machinery to fast forward into the future, only to then walk backwards towards the current time and connecting the invisible dots. As compared to our primate counterparts, we are far better at this ability than anybody can imagine. So we are not only able to distinguish between immediate, intermediate, and future goals, but we have the capacity to pursue such goals in not just one, but many domains of life. So I may be managing this goal pursuit in my personal life, professional life, interpersonal social life, my social entrepreneurship life, just, fun and entertaining desires kind of thing. So a plan then is a blueprint for implementing intentions. And the process of planning is the capacity to organize present behaviors, as Dr. Baumeister was saying, and evaluate these behaviors to see if they will help you accomplish the anticipated future outcomes. And this constant appraisal or constant comparison and evaluation is really what makes amazing planners very effective.
So now talk to us about flexibility. I think that's important too.
Yes, absolutely. So it's not just adequate to make a plan. You must actually make sure that the plan gets you the outcome that you want. So the plan is literally a vehicle to get to the destination of intention. So if you have an intention, then you have a plan. Without an intention, there's no plan. So in order to make plan more effective, a couple of things need to happen. One is to have a great sense, realistic sense of the goals that one is coming up for oneself. It will be ludicrous for me to say that I will become a professional singer. I may think that I'm capable, but it's not really realistic. And the capacity to anticipate all that can go wrong, to remake the plan and rethink is the feature of that flexibility. And that capacity to think fluidly is also part of the function of prefrontal system. Then the way I've been thinking about this and doing this for the last 20 years is how does a clinician design training that's based on these principles that I just described? So one needs to be very good at helping people connect between the capacity to make a plan by sequencing steps, the capacity to envision the course of execution, the capacity to anticipate glitches or last minute changes, the capacity to generate alternatives, and the capacity to shift flexibly to plan B without any mental shutdown. So these capacities is what one needs to sharpen and train to get a patient to be very proficient. So the other thought about this flexibility is while you're executing the plan, there are barriers that come along. And these barriers, some are very good at anticipating these barriers, and some of them are not good at anticipating the barriers. As Dr. Baumeister was talking about this, that some people are really good at predicting other people's behaviors rather than their own. In general, we as humans are far better at standing on the sidelines and seeing somebody perform and predict what they will do well or not do well. But we just don't have that capacity to stand on the sideline for oneself. And the last thing that I was thinking about this flexibility is that problem happens when we get tunnel visioned and we are not able to think about the long-term goals without them connected to the short-term or vice versa. However, good problem solvers are really good at thinking on their feet. So this just reminded me of a story that I read. There was an article in 2015. The title read that beauty school break beatdown. These women were at a salon and they were using their curling irons and blow dryers, and they were going about their business. So their short-term goal was to get somebody's hair done. Long-term was to succeed in their business. And then there came an intermediate goal, which is somebody kind of broke into and, a guy came with a gun and was trying to rob the beauty school. So one of the women was very quick to think on her feet, and she used her curling iron and beat the heck out of him. So this capacity to use the curling iron to actually curl hair and then shift flexibly and use that to beat a robber is a great example of flexibility.
I also, though, I have to think that knowing thyself is really, really important for planning. Yeah.
I know. So planning and self-efficacy go hand in hand. And it's interesting. My work comes from cognitive rehabilitation, and the training never focused on discussing self-efficacy process as much as I began to study the psychological processes. So, famous psychologist and social scientist Albert Bandura defined self-efficacy as an individual's belief in his or her own capacity to execute behaviors necessary to produce specific performance attainments. In other words, this ability lets us exert control over our own environment, our own inner state of motivation, our drive, and ultimately create or produce those corresponding behaviors. So Henry Ford's quote, you must have heard this, that if you think you can do and if you think you can do, you're right. So we struggle with something called better than average effect. So we have this grand sense of self where we actually assume that we are capable of doing a lot more and a lot better than we truly are. So the self-knowledge can evolve through time and is sculpted through practice. So self-belief plays a pivotal role in shaping effort, which eventually contributes to mastery. So I do think that people who have incredible hours of practice behind them tend to have a lot better sense of their self-efficacy. So I'll end my thought here about this point, this takeaway that Mahatma Gandhi said that your belief becomes your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits, your habits become your values, and your values become your destiny. So this ability to see that your every action connects to the larger sense of self, your larger sense of self feeds your motivation in current moment, those who have that understanding do far better.
Sucheta, what makes a good plan go wrong, go bad?
Many, many things, Todd, as Dr. Baumeister was talking about. The first is that reluctance to make plan with the fear that the plan may not work out. But once the plan is made, I think, so just a couple of components, which I already mentioned, that to make an effective plan, you need to be able to think backwards, imagine ideal outcomes, and anticipate roadblocks. If you're able to do these three things, then you can make a good plan. But what we know that actually the roadblock in planning is something called planning fallacy, which Dr. Baumeister touched upon, that it's a universally occurring and one of the most robustly proven cognitive biases, which points out that we have a tendency to believe that the task we have planned will be completed as planned, even though our past experience suggests otherwise. Those who are familiar with Nobel Prize-winning research psychologist Daniel Kahneman's work, they will know that he and his research partner, Amos Tversky, coined this term in 1970s. Recently, we have come to understand this phenomenon even more. And what it shows that we as humans are systematically good at underestimating the amount of time it takes to do something, but it's not limited to time. It also extends to money. We estimate we will spend and the risks we are willing to take. We tend to, of course, tend to underestimate that. So this capacity, this planning fallacy is one of the biggest roadblocks in being successful at planning.
I'm sure you're familiar with the famous quote from General Eisenhower during World War II when he said that in battle, plans are useless, but the process of planning is critically important. So all that you're talking about here is shedding some new light on that famous quote. So some great stuff. Any final thoughts, Sucheta, that you want to share?
Yeah, as we close, Todd, this is such an important topic. And Dr. Roy Baumeister is one of the world's leading researchers. And I have thought long and hard about this topic. And his work has influenced my work. And so I would love to kind of sum it up for people, particularly clinicians and parents who are working with kids like this, or adults who are trying to manage their own planning skills, that number one, a planning skill is a teachable skill. Those particularly suffer with executive dysfunction have a challenge, and teaching them planning skills is a monumental task. Long ago in my practice, I realized that teaching planning is more than simply helping clients write down steps to getting things done. It does require addressing many psychological challenges, including things like focal biases, motivational roadblocks, anchoring effect, which I haven't even gone into, but we'll have some guests in the future who'll talk about this. The clinician must consider many factors, including gathering answers to some of the questions I'm going to list here. First, for example, is how multifaceted is client's life and how many active domains is he trying to pursue? Has client chosen the right goals for self? And that judgment is off, then the clinician needs to come in and shape some of those choices. And are these goals realistic and attainable during training process? Otherwise, the clinician can easily redirect. Can the client imagine or visualize the starting and ending point for each goal? Can the clinician create training that translates into process where the client connects the immediate, intermediate, and distant future goals? And how are planning fallacies influencing clients' planning errors? So all those thoughts need to go into really making clients effective planners. I hope you all, those who are listening, will make a plan in writing, reflect on the past successes and failures, and when you're executing tasks that are similar, really remind yourself of the roadblocks that you ran into. And research shows simply by remembering the roadblocks, people tend to actually recorrect the course in the planning itself rather than having to adjust later. So I hope all this really helps.
Oh, it's a lot of great material. Lots to think about here, as is usual for all your conversations, Sucheta. So that's all the time we have for today. Unfortunately, on behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thank you for tuning in and listening today. We look forward to seeing you again right here next week. We'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full PreFrontal.